Why did a young soldier in a red beret just tell the world's largest aid organizations to turn their trucks around? For decades, the story of Africa has been told through the lens of pity, a narrative of dry, cracked earth and children waiting for a foreign hand to bring a bowl of grain. But today, a new sound is drowning out the whispers of victimhood. It is the roar of excavators in the Bama Valley and the rush of water through stone-lined canals. We are witnessing the first shots of a different kind of war, not one fought with bullets, but with irrigation and seeds. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the leader of Burkina Faso, has stood on the parched soil of his ancestors and made a declaration that has sent a shiver through the boardrooms of Washington and Paris. He is not asking for mercy, he is seizing sovereignty. In the heart of the Sahel, where the West predicted only hunger and chaos, a green miracle is taking root that threatens to dismantle the century-old industry of aid dependency. This is not just about rice or wheat. It is about the dignity of a man who refuses to let his children be fed by the same powers that exploited their land. If you believe that a nation's true independence begins in its own soil, and if you are tired of seeing billions in aid vanish while the people remain in chains, then you need to hear this story. Stay with me for the next few minutes, because what is happening in Bama is a blueprint for a rising Africa that no longer needs Western permission to survive. Could this single project be the spark that finally ends the era of foreign control over African food? The transformation of the Bama Valley is not merely a construction project. It is a tactical offensive against the very idea of African scarcity. Ibrahim Traoré has mobilized the state's resources to create a massive irrigation network that bypasses the traditional, slow-moving bureaucracy of international lenders. By focusing on localized water control, Burkina Faso is reclaiming thousands of hectares of previously dormant land, turning them into high-yield rice and cereal fields. This is where the green miracle takes a physical form. Imagine the sheer scale of the effort, hundreds of miles of new canals carved through the earth, powered by solar energy and managed by local cooperatives rather than foreign corporations. The goal is clear and ambitious: to secure food for over 10 million citizens, effectively neutralizing the threat of hunger that has long been used as a tool for political leverage by outside powers. To understand the weight of this change, one must look at the face of a man like Ibrahim, a farmer who has spent 65 years watching his children grow up in the shadow of uncertainty. For decades, Ibrahim's life was dictated by the rain and the arrival of the United Nations food trucks. He describes the quiet humiliation of standing in line, waiting for a sack of grain stamped with a foreign flag, a reminder that his survival was a matter of charity, not right. But today, the sound of the pumps has replaced the rumble of those trucks. Ibrahim no longer looks to the horizon for dust clouds from a delivery convoy. He looks at the green shoots rising from his own soil. He is part of a generation that is learning for the first time that the hand that feeds you also controls you. By breaking that hand, Traoré is giving men like Ibrahim their pride back. This shift is creating a profound ripple effect across the Sahel. While the West continues to preach about sustainable development from air-conditioned offices in Europe, the Burkinabè people are out in the mud, digging their own future. Traoré has integrated the military into this mission, turning soldiers into builders and farmers, ensuring that the defense of the nation includes the defense of the dinner table. This is the Traoré doctrine in action: total mobilization for total independence. Every ton of rice harvested in Bama is a ton of rice that doesn't need to be imported from a global market that is increasingly volatile and biased. As the water flows into the fields of Bama, it carries with it the hope of an entire continent watching closely. Like the water flowing through Bama's canals, truth cannot be contained. If you have witnessed the strength of a people reclaiming their destiny, share one thing you've learned in the comments below to keep this narrative moving forward. The world needs to know that the era of the beggar nation is over, and the era of the sovereign producer has begun. But as these fields turn green, A shadow is falling over the old mining orders and the diplomatic circles that once managed Africa's poverty. What happens when the silent backyard of the world suddenly finds its voice and refuses to be quiet again? The emerald fields of Bama are more than a successful harvest. They represent a battlefield where the world's longest-standing lie is finally being incinerated. As the water surges through these newly carved canals, it is not just quenching the physical thirst of the soil, it is drowning the arrogant leverage of the International Monetary Fund in the cold shadow of the old colonial masters who, for over a century, insisted that Africa could not survive without their permission. The tension in the global air is palpable, heavy with the scent of a dying order. In the silent, gilded halls of Paris and Washington, there is a stunned, uncomfortable realization. They watched for decades as billions in aid disappeared into a calculated cycle of poverty. Yet they are now witnessing a young man in a red beret achieve more with local sweat and raw African determination than their decades of mentorship ever intended to produce. The climax of this struggle isn't a military skirmish. It is a spiritual resurrection. It is the moment Ibrahim Traoré stood before his people and declared that the belly of Burkina Faso would no longer be audited by foreign interests. It is the moment the world realized that when you teach a nation to feed itself, you lose the absolute power to starve them into submission. The reaction from the global elite has been a masterpiece of calculated fear, poorly disguised as humanitarian concern. They warn of instability, they mutter about market disruptions, and they move with frantic energy to freeze assets in a desperate, dying attempt to maintain the status quo. But they have failed to realize that the spirit of the Sahel has already shifted beyond their reach. Across the vibrant streets of Ouagadougou and the deep villages of the interior, there is a surge of national pride that no sanction can wither and no threat can contain. This is the David versus Goliath moment of the 21st century, a small nation standing against a giant system of debt and dependency. The Western powers, once seen as invincible giants of industry and charity, now appear as aging, panicked gatekeepers trying to hold back a tidal wave of independence with nothing but paper threats and hollow promises. Traoré has unmasked the ultimate colonial lie, the myth that Africa is a dark continent waiting for light from abroad. He has shown that the light was always there, buried deep under layers of forced dependency and a stolen national narrative. For the veterans and the fathers watching from across the ocean in America, this resonates with the most fundamental human truth. Dignity is never a gift. It is a right you seize with your own hands. We are seeing a leader who does not look like a polished politician, but acts like a grounded protector. A man who understands that a father's greatest shame is an empty plate, and his greatest victory is a full granary earned through honest labor. This is the green miracle, but the true miracle isn't just the rice, it is the restoration of the African soul. The reaction isn't found in the scripted headlines of the mainstream media. It's in the eyes of the African mother, who no longer has to bow her head in the dust for a sack of foreign flour. It is in the steady pulse of the African youth, who now see their soil not as a graveyard of dreams, but as a laboratory of hope. This is the emotional peak of the revolution, the collective, earth-shaking realization that the chains were never just on the wrists, but in the mind, and those chains have just been shattered by the sound of rushing water in Bama. Traoré's defiance has created a geopolitical earthquake that is redrawing the map of human possibility. By prioritizing the national development achievement of food over the international debt obligations of the IMF, he has effectively fired the architects of African poverty. The globalists are panicking because they know that if Burkina Faso succeeds, the entire continent will wake up from its long, induced slumber. If the green miracle can happen here, in the heart of the sapped and sanctioned Sahel, then no nation on earth has an excuse to remain a beggar. This is the ultimate threat to the old mining order and the lopsided trade deals that kept Africa's gold flowing out while its people's hunger flowed in. If this story shook you to your core, type, "I am here," and stay, for we are recording the birth of a new era. The silence of the West is the sound of a falling empire, while the noise from the pumps at Bama is the anthem of a rising world. Traoré didn't just expel the spies and the diplomats. He expelled the silence that allowed the world to ignore Africa's potential for too long. We are watching a transformation that defies their logic but fulfills our destiny. As the sun sets over the Bama canals, the reflection on the water is not just of the sky, but of a future where Africa stands tall, unbought, and unafraid. The world is changing, and the question is no longer whether Africa can lead itself, but whether the rest of the world is ready to follow a leader who leads with the truth. The victory at Bama is translating into a profound restructuring of the Burkinabè social contract. For the first time in history, the government is not seen as a distant tax collector or a puppet of foreign interests, but as a direct provider of the tools for survival. The civil consequences are visible in the markets of the interior, where the influx of locally grown grain has stabilized prices and broken the back of the predatory import monopolies. We are seeing a reverse migration, not of people fleeing to the coast in search of menial labor, but of young men returning to the land with their heads held high. They are trading the uncertainty of the city for the stability of the soil, realizing that a nation that can feed itself can also protect itself. This is the birth of a sovereign middle class, a generation of farmers and engineers who owe their prosperity to their own sweat and their leaders' vision, rather than the whims of a global market. Politically, the irrigation offensive has effectively neutralized the primary weapon used by external powers to destabilize the Sahel, the threat of induced famine. In the past, any leader who dared to challenge the Western consensus was met with a withdrawal of food aid, leading to civil unrest and eventual collapse. Traoré has flipped the script. By ensuring that the granaries are full, he has removed the fuse from the hunger bomb that the West has long used to trigger regime change. The internal political atmosphere is no longer one of desperation, but of disciplined purpose. The military's role as the vanguard of this agricultural revolution has forged an unbreakable bond between the people and the army, creating a firewall against the covert power battles that once plagued the region. The ripple effects are crossing borders, as the Bama model becomes the gold standard for the AES alliance. Mali and Niger are watching, taking notes, and preparing to launch their own offensives against the desert. The political reality is that Africa is no longer a blind spot for the world's intelligence agencies. It is becoming a center of organized, self-sufficient power. The old politicians who profited from the aid industry are finding themselves obsolete, replaced by a new cadre of leaders who measure success in tons of rice rather than millions in foreign credit. The streets that were once silent in the face of suffering are now loud with the commerce of a nation that has reclaimed its destiny. But as this internal stability grows, how will Washington and the old colonial capitals respond to a region that no longer begs at their gates? The success of Bama has made Burkina Faso a target, not because it is failing, but because it is succeeding too well on its own terms. The question is no longer about whether the people can survive, but about how far the old powers will go to prevent this green miracle from spreading across the entire continent. The green miracle in the Bama Valley has sent shockwaves far beyond the borders of the Sahel, forcing a radical reassessment of African strategy in the corridors of power from Washington to Brussels. For the U.S. national security establishment, the rise of a self-sufficient Burkina Faso represents a direct challenge to the decades-old framework of influence through aid. In the past, American and European policy in Africa was built on a foundation of managed poverty, where food shipments and conditional loans served as the primary levers of control. Now, as Ibrahim Traoré effectively fires the aid agencies and replaces foreign wheat with Burkinabè rice, those levers are snapping. The global view is one of profound anxiety for the old mining order. The Western media often frames this shift as a turn toward instability. Yet for the American observer, especially the veteran who has seen the failure of nation-building efforts abroad, the reality is far simpler. This is a nation finally standing on its own feet. While the US and the EU express concern over the AES alliance's pivot toward new partners like Russia and China, the people of the Sahel see it as a diversification of power that ends the Western monopoly on their future. The strategic consequence is clear. The era of Africa as a passive recipient of Western mercy is over. Washington is now forced to choose between a path of continued confrontation, marked by sanctions and diplomatic freezes, or a path of genuine partnership based on mutual respect and sovereignty. Traoré's irrigation offensive has proven that the Sahel is no longer a blind spot for intelligence and control. It is an emerging fortress of dignity. As the world watches the maps of the Sahel being redrawn by the flow of water rather than the lines of colonial treaties, a haunting question lingers in the air of the global capitals. If Africa can feed itself, if it can protect itself, and if it can trade on its own terms, what remains of the old world's claim to leadership? The transformation we see in the Bama Valley is not merely a seasonal success or a temporary spike in crop yields. It is a prophetic warning etched into the very earth of the Sahel. For those who believe the old order of dependency can be maintained through the sheer force of sanctions and cold diplomacy, let this be their final wake-up call. If the alliance of the Sahel, forged by the iron will of Ibrahim Traoré, continues to unite their soil, their water, and their collective spirit, the leverage of foreign powers will evaporate like morning mist under the African sun. We are standing at a crossroads in human history where the world must finally decide: is this a threat to your stability, or is it the most significant victory for human dignity in our lifetime? Traoré is not just building dams and digging canals. He is building a fortress of the soul, where no African mother will ever again have to trade her national pride for a sack of imported, subsidized flour. He has proven to the world that when you stop auditing a nation's poverty and start investing in its people's untapped potential, miracles are not just possible, they are inevitable. But let this serve as a stern warning to the architects of the old world. The silence of Africa has ended. The era of the beggar continent is being buried in the very irrigation trenches of Bama, replaced by a sovereign power that is calm, unstoppable, and deeply rooted in its own ancestral land. For the American viewer, especially the men who have spent a lifetime valuing hard work, family protection, and the sanctity of independence, this story resonates with the core of our own identity. We recognize in Traoré the virtues we were taught to honor: the courage to stand alone, the discipline to build when others destroy, and the moral clarity to put one's own people first. We see a leader who doesn't look like a career politician, but acts like a true protector. A man who understands that a nation's true freedom isn't found in a foreign bank account, but in the ability to feed its own children from its own dirt. As we look at the emerald green rising from the red dust of Burkina Faso, we must ask ourselves the ultimate question: is Ibrahim Traoré a danger to the world, or is he the only leader with the courage to prove that Africa was always capable of leading itself? The answer is not hidden in the filtered headlines of the West. It is shouting from the full granaries and the proud, level gaze of the Burkinabè people. If this story of raw resilience and reclaimed dignity touched your heart, share your thoughts below. Let the world know that you still believe every nation deserves the right to own its future. If you still believe in justice, in the unyielding strength of the human spirit, and in a world where freedom is grown from the soil, press like and subscribe to stay with us on this journey. May God bless the hands that work the earth, and may the spirit of independence flow through Bama and beyond like an uncontainable river.